Hello again. In the 1960s, when Southern Africa, as we have seen in the last couple of lectures, began its immersion in violent conflicts over decolonization or heightened repression in the case of South Africa, at that time, most Africans, most African countries were embarking on the first years of freedom from colonial rule. We need to return to them, to those situations. After all, this was the majority of the African population, the majority of African countries. What was this experience of independence like? We need to remind ourselves also of just what the nationalists had won. They had taken control of a colonial apparatus, the state, of course, formerly colonial at this stage. And finally, we need to ask the question with which we ended Lecture 24. What would they do with this new prize? Anyone who watches film footage of the official ceremonies marking independence, typically the lowering as national anthems are played. God Save the Queen is played in the background, the Union Jack is lowered, and then the new flag of Zambia or Kenya or Nigeria or Ghana is raised. The same for the tricolore of the French and so on. Very often, of course, a new flag for a nation with a new name, Ghana instead of the Gold Coast, or eventually Zimbabwe instead of Southern Rhodesia. Certainly Zambia instead of Northern Rhodesia in the period I'm referring to. When you see those packed in crowds, the surging, you're taken with one great emotion: joy, freedom, ours at last. Now the world will see the new Africa. The feeling was genuine and it was thrilling. I'm reminded again of that very simple statement by the great Ghanaian historian opening an article on the period from his own reminiscence. It was certainly great to be alive in those days. But clearly the expectations raised in the heady ride to independence would be a challenge to meet. It's worth repeating a point we made earlier in looking at decolonization in Lecture 24, and that is that in the late colonial period, some of the officials in places like France and Britain concluded that disappointment was coming and that it would be better for it to be directed at African rulers as opposed to themselves. Nonetheless, the new citizens were not passively awaiting the delivery of the fruits of freedom. The widespread mobilization of the nationalist movements during the 1940s and 50s carried over into a widespread willingness to pitch in, to participate in, to personally work toward the next great triumph, development. And in this case, they don't mean the sort of halfway house, the half-hearted development of the developmentalist states which Britain and France turned to in the late colonial period. No, we want the full measure, the real thing, and we want it under our own direction, our own supervision, and not yours. So there's a tremendous amount of energy which is apparent in the early years after independence in country after country. In Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta, who had been in jail, after all, up until 1959, when he cried out at his post-independence rallies, "Harambee," Swahili for "let's pull together," the crowds yelled it back, and they meant it. They yelled it back with enthusiasm. And indeed, many of the achievements of these years depended on the self-help initiatives of energize local communities, efforts to build the new school, to clear the way and create or build the new road or repair the old one, the bridge that needs the same sort of work. Often we saw this in a sort of work party atmosphere, punctuated with songs from the nationalist struggle, and so on. Despite this popular participation, which was real and widespread, and again, genuine and enthusiastic, still, there was no getting around the pivotal role of the state. The colonial states had been highly interventionist, sponsoring and orchestrating the colonial economies, perhaps especially in the late colonial developmentalist period. Now, I often find that people assume, and it's a natural assumption, that coolness in independent Africa, coolness toward what we might call free market approaches, hesitations towards that. People assume that largely stems from having a socialist or quasi-socialist perspective. And of course that would be correct. But in fact, some of this coolness, some of this hesitation comes from the colonial roots. Those state apparatuses that the nationalists had inherited, of course, had deeply interventionist, often counter-market, certainly counter-free market tendencies and character. Now, the new leaders had no intention of changing this large interventionist state role, except perhaps to make it even larger. Remember Nkrumah's mantra, the father of African nationalism, the first to become president of an independent sub-Saharan state, Ghana, in 1957. "Seek ye first the political kingdom," Nkrumah had said, "and use it to add all else." Nkrumah, of course, had spent his Sundays when he was a student at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, attending African-American churches. And he borrowed some of his rhetorical style from what he saw there. And as you can see, he also learned some scripture. He's paraphrasing there, of course, seeking ye first the kingdom of God. Seek ye first the political kingdom. Seize the apparatus of the state, turn it to add the other things that we seek, above all, real development. So although Nkrumah and others had in fact exploited during the nationalist crescendo the resentment of farmers over colonial marketing boards, after he took power, he was quite prepared to retain them. Again, the notion of the board was a monopsony, a sole buyer, which bought, in this case, especially cocoa in a situation like Ghana, at a given price, sold it on the world market at another price. This was a resentment during the colonial period because, of course, they felt that the margin was going, in essence, into the colonists' hands. In the independence period, Nkrumah retains the boards and uses the margin, or at least says he will use the margin, promises to use the margin to finance other projects. In the avowedly radical states like Ghana and like Tanzania in East Africa, usually proclaiming themselves to be, quote, African socialist as opposed to rigidly Marxist, a good measure of nationalization took place, as well as some experiments with state farms and so on. Take the case of Tanzania, where Julius Nyerere, the former teacher who had earned the affectionate nickname of Mwalimu, or teacher in Swahili, and had studied overseas and so forth, Nyerere issued, in a sense, his African Socialist Manifesto, if you like, in 1967, the Arusha Declaration. And it's still an eloquent and impressive document, essentially articulating a vision of socialism built on traditional African values. It's, in a sense, the sort of economic side of his articulation of the one-party state, which we'll turn to in the next lecture. But what I'm trying to get at is an approach which blends ideas from the outside, in this case socialism, with ideas generated from African culture itself. But in the name of his African socialism, Nyerere pushed a disastrous villagization scheme, the Ujamaa scheme. It comes back to a notion of familyhood, if you like, in Tanzania, the Ujamaa villages, forcing farmers into compact settlements. It did not work. Such schemes, like the state marketing boards, the state farms, express perhaps an ominous fear of a truly independent, vigorous peasantry, despite the fact, again, that quite a number of the new leaders had risen to power precisely on the grievances of such peasantries. Now, I've been stressing a state role, an interventionist role, the overall orchestration and management of an economy. And we've seen, as we would expect, that in the more radical regimes, the quasi-socialist or African socialist regimes, we would expect that. But it was also common to see it, a state role inserted or expanded into numerous enterprises in conservative regimes, those, for instance, of Senegal or the Ivory Coast or indeed of Kenya. A word that often came up at this time was parastatal, meaning precisely the notion that there's a kind of public-private blend here, a partnership between a substantial state role, whether it's owning shares in the name of the government or the insertion of publicly paid officials into the steel production or the textile industry or what have you. Parastatals. Now, whatever the longer-term weaknesses of these approaches, for a while, and it was a good while, it wasn't simply a moment, for a while they yielded some impressive results. The economic growth of the late colonial developmentalist period, and certainly in macro terms there had been substantial economic growth in the late colonial periods, this not only continued, but in fact increased and accelerated in quite a number of cases. Overall, the GNP, gross national product per capita for all of sub-Saharan Africa, grew each year in the 1960s and through the first half, approximately, of the 1970s, often at rates, quite respectable rates, of some 2 to 3% a year. Again, that's an overall per capita rise in GNP after independence. Kenya, to use one example, per capita GNP rose 30% in the 10 years after independence for Kenya in 1963. That of the Ivory Coast doubled in 20 years after its independence in 1960. Even manufacturing industrialization, and this is often taken to be the sort of litmus test, the measuring rod, if you like, of economic modernization and development to many, whether on the right or the left. Even manufacturing had its moment. It expanded overall on the continent at twice the rate of the overall GDP improvement or increase between 1965 and 1973. Despite this, African economies failed to achieve a truly meaningful diversification. What boom there was rested largely on exports of primary products produced by farmers and miners. In other words, the dependency on an export-import economic base forged in the colonial period, as we know, as we've seen, was only marginally altered. This continued to be the basis of the development that we're seeing. In this respect, we need to go global again to achieve an understanding, just as we introduced the Cold War to look at political developments in places like the old Belgian Congo, in places like Angola last time. In this respect, the expansionary world economy of the 1960s, and it was a very expansionary economy indeed in that era, was extremely important to this whole process. In particular, the buoyant commodity demand and prices were the context, if you like, for the sorts of successes that we are seeing, which is not to minimize them. One still must take advantage of even favorable conditions, and country after country, and indeed we must concede that leader after leader showed some skill in doing that. Now, most impressive of all, certainly to ordinary people, the new African governments kept their promises, in many cases to improve education and health care. Between 1960 and 1980, sub-Saharan school enrollment rose by over 50% at the primary level. It rose by over 500% at the secondary level. That is a five-fold increase in people, African children, attending high school. All the new nations built universities, which, with a handful of exceptions, had not even existed before independence and were symbolically incredibly important. Countries like Tanzania made concerted efforts to give rural populations access to clinics. Infant mortality rates dropped. Life expectancy rose. Of course, that implied that population was going to rise. At this stage, that was not a particular problem. In fact, one could even count on a rising population from some perspectives as an asset. Later, under different conditions, these larger populations, of course, may indeed pose a very different question and a very different kind of problem. Now, I've been generalizing so far about Africa's first decade, the first fruits of freedom, the first tastes of freedom that Africa experienced with independence in or around 1960. Let me focus this a bit and let me personalize it a bit and try to illustrate some of these points from my own experiences in the place I know best, my first love in Africa as far as countries go, and that is the country of Zambia. Northern Rhodesia, of course, the British territory, originally created by Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company. When Northern Rhodesia became Zambia in 1964, the new currency which the government adopted and came into general use at that time, the new currency was called the kwacha, still called the kwacha. The kwacha was a word from a couple of the languages spoken in Zambia, and the meaning was dawn. To me, that captures perfectly the exhilaration of the times. The various symbols on the kwacha, the sequoia, the fish eagle, very reminiscent when you look at it of course, the symbolism of the American bald eagle or golden eagle as the symbol of freedom. The portrayals of the statue which stands there in central Lusaka of the very muscular African literally breaking the chains of colonial rule. That appears on the kwacha, it appears on the currency itself. The president of Zambia, of course, the hero of the nationalist struggle, was Kenneth David Kaunda. And he certainly seemed to many, both inside Zambia and outside, as the epitome of decency. Kaunda's father had been an African missionary. We often forget that many of the missionaries in Africa have been, in fact, Africans themselves. But like a lot of missionaries, he carried his gospel from one place to another. In this case, Kaunda's father had come from Nyasaland next door, now Malawi, where Livingstone's old influence of the Scottish Presbyterian missionaries, in a sense, was reflected, and had come into the northern part of Zambia earlier in the century and settled there as a teacher and a pastor, a preacher in Zambia. So Kaunda, raised in that household, as he very lovingly evokes in his autobiography. Again, an autobiography, it's a memoir. It's certainly not his whole life. Kaunda very much still with us. But published in 1962, Zambia Shall Be Free. His, again, loving portrait of that upbringing with his father and mother in a remote mission station of northern Zambia. In short, what I'm getting at is that he was a thoughtful and sincere Christian, and he's a very devout man indeed. Eventually, he expounded his political philosophy, his sort of counterpart to Nyereri's Arusha Declaration, was the development of Kaunda's philosophy, ideology of humanism. And this was indeed a people-centered vision, like the Arusha Declaration, quite impressive, eloquent, an articulation of an approach to public affairs, to life itself, to questions like development centered on people. And in Kaunda's own view of it, something which avoids the extremes of either capitalism or socialism, avoids the extremes of right or left. Kaunda, again, seemed then, and in a lot of respects still seems, to be both dignified and down to earth. I interviewed him once for my own historical research purposes. And like a lot of others who have come away from a personal encounter with Kenneth Kaunda, it was the word gentleman that first came to my lips. Now, although Zambia was obviously still a third world country, Zambia's economy, when I first went there in the mid-1970s, the early to mid-1970s, was humming. It was fat. You can spell that F-A-T or spell it like my students do, P-H-A-T. But it had a lot going for it. Again, I don't want to overstate this. Obviously, it was a poor country, but people had work. If you went down Cairo Road in central Lusaka, you could see on either side the cranes on the tops of these building, adding stories and putting up new skyscrapers. There were goods in the shops, and so on. Now, again, the reason for this in economic terms, although for a time it had to be managed adequately, and for a time it was managed adequately, the reason behind it, though, was that Zambia, almost totally dependent on copper export, was still riding the long copper boom, which began in the post-World War II era. It's not accidental that when they constructed the new Parliament House in Zambia, again, a symbol of this new age and the pride of this new age, its roof over this considerable expanse of this building is 100% copper. It's a symbol of the new age. The University of Zambia. I mentioned the establishment of these new universities as an achievement of this first taste of freedom, this first experience with independence. University of Zambia, built out on the Great East Road, obviously east of town and in Lusaka, was a citadel. You know, you approach it, it has this very modern architecture, shiny white appearance from a distance on a small rise, a small hill. I was a research affiliate there, and I found the place to be full of dedicated teachers. A number of those, quite a number of those at that point, were still expatriates. They were from many other countries in the world who wanted to be there. They wanted to play their part, at least make a contribution to what they saw as this era of hope taking shape in modern Africa. It was full of idealistic and very committed students. It was an exciting place to be. Now, to localize this even further, the village where I did much field work was located in southern Zambia, in the so-called Tonga ethnic group, or inside the Tonga-dominated area of Zambia. At this point in the early to mid-1970s, small farmers, and that's what everybody in that village was. They were peasant households. They enjoyed a steady income from sales of maize, cotton, sunflower, seeds, and cattle. Again, I don't want to overstate this. These were not commercial farmers, and they didn't live like commercial farmers. But this was, for a time at least, a prosperous peasantry. The pride of the village, and perhaps the one symbol that strikes me still today as representing the promise of the New Age, the sine qua non, the symbol more than any other, the meaning of independence, was the new primary school, Chiubola Primary School. The construction of this, which was partly a state enterprise, but partly, again, this mass participation, local pitch-in construction, became, in essence, the centerpiece of the whole village life. And I can't stress enough the fact that this was taken to mean that the fruits of independence have reached us, that we can be part of this new age like anyone else. So there was a dawn, there was a kwacha in much of Africa with the coming of independence, and the new rulers deserve considerable credit for it. There were omens on the horizon, however, and we might mention a couple. I said earlier that a ruler like Nkrumah in Ghana had not dismantled the marketing boards, which, of course, he had criticized so vociferously during the nationalist rise. And I mentioned that his reason for not doing so, his stated reason, was to use the margin between the producer price and the selling price to finance other projects, usually said to be development projects. But it's also true that Nkrumah began to invest some of that margin and numerous other marginal resources that he was able to control because he controlled the state in what we can call showcase projects. The notion of the Volta Dam, which remains a fairly dubious large-scale investment in Ghana, but certainly was the sort of project which puts you on the map, which gets attention. The construction, of the new national stadium for the soccer teams that'll now be wearing our new national colors. Back to Nkrumah's case, the construction, which he definitely put resources into, of a new headquarters for the OAU, the Organization of African Unity. Now, these kinds of showcase projects, again, were symbolic enough, but they did not necessarily represent the same sort of investment in ongoing development that other investments did. The new rulers rather furtively tried to instill a sense of identity with the new nation, as opposed to especially an ethnicity. Now, we've mentioned this challenge before, we've said it many times, but all the new nations encompassed a number of different ethnic groups, and they faced a tall order. They had some success with it. The counterpart to Kenyatta's shouting Harambee and having it recalled is that Kaunda at his rallies would shout "One Zambia," and the crowd would shout back "One nation." One Zambia, one nation. People did come to think of themselves as Zambians to a considerable extent, but that was easier to do during these buoyant times. And finally, still enjoying, perhaps deserving, and I would say they did deserve, considerable popular support, the newly independent leaders could afford varying degrees of tolerance. After all, if you don't feel that you're in danger of losing your political office, it creates some room, some space for you to allow opposition, whether those are parties or critics or what have you. Already, however, even by the late 60s, by the early 70s, during this favorable first boom period in the post-independence years, there were moves afoot to stifle opposition. Having won power, none of these leaders planned to surrender it. Still, despite these omens, the achievement of independence was exactly that. It was impressive and I refuse to see it cynically. A new Africa had been born. Thank you.